Sky Thief, the D.B. Cooper mystery. FBI analysts found, decades after, the only unsolved aircraft hijacking in American history, a partial DNA profile extracted from a clip-on necktie left behind on seat 18E of Northwest Orient Flight 305. And that profile has brought investigators closer than ever to answering the question that has haunted American law enforcement for more than 50 years. Who was D.B. Cooper? The date was November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. A man purchased a ticket at Portland International Airport under the name Dan Cooper, not D.B. Cooper, a name invented by a journalist who misheard a police radio transmission and accidentally gave the case its lasting identity. The man was described as calm, well-dressed, wearing a dark suit, a black clip-on tie, and sunglasses. He was estimated to be in his mid-40s. He ordered a bourbon and soda after boarding and paid for it in cash. Northwest Orient Flight 305 was a short-haul route, Portland to Seattle, 45 minutes in the air. There were 36 passengers and 6 crew members. The Boeing 727 was the workhorse of American domestic aviation in 1971, a narrow-body jet that most travelers had ridden dozens of times. Nothing about that particular flight appeared unusual, until the man in seat 18C handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Schaffner initially assumed it was an unsolicited phone number. She folded it and put it in her pocket. The man leaned toward her and said quietly that she should read it immediately. The note said he had a bomb. He opened his briefcase briefly to show her what appeared to be red cylinders and wires. His demands were specific: $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 military and 2 civilian, and a fuel truck ready in Seattle. He wanted the money in a knapsack. He was polite throughout. He ordered another drink. He was entirely, unnervingly composed. Air traffic control recordings found in the National Archives document the negotiations between Northwest Orient ground staff, FBI agents, and the man calling himself Dan Cooper in precise, clipped exchanges. A bureaucratic record of one of the most audacious crimes of the 20th century unfolding in real time. The plane circled Seattle for 2 hours while the FBI assembled the ransom. The $200,000 came from a consortium of Seattle banks. The serial numbers of every bill were photographed. 4 parachutes were delivered, 2 civilian sport chutes and 2 military backpack parachutes. Shortly after dark, the plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Cooper released all 36 passengers and 1 flight attendant in exchange for the money and the parachutes. He kept 3 crew members aboard: the pilot, the co-pilot, and a flight attendant named Tina Mucklow, who would later describe his demeanor throughout as polite, even considerate. He tipped her. He offered to send a food order back to the remaining crew. He then gave the pilots a specific set of instructions for the return flight: heading southeast toward Mexico City, altitude below 10,000 feet, landing gear down, flaps at 15 degrees, airspeed as slow as the aircraft could manage without stalling. He wanted the rear air stair, a built-in staircase in the tail of the Boeing 727 that could be deployed in flight, left operable. At approximately 8 in the evening, somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, the crew felt the pressure change that indicated the rear air stair had been lowered. They never saw Cooper again. When the plane landed in Reno for fuel, the rear cabin was empty. The hijacker had stepped into the dark, into rain and 30-mile-per-hour winds at an altitude of around 10,000 feet, carrying $200,000 and wearing a business suit. Case files found in the FBI's NORJAC investigation archive, the name derived from Northwest hijacking, document the largest and most sustained manhunt in the agency's history up to that point, and its complete failure to identify, locate, or apprehend the man who had walked off a commercial aircraft and vanished into the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The search began immediately. Military units, state police, and civilian volunteers combed the forests of southwestern Washington through the winter of 1971 and into 1972. The search area was enormous. Cooper could have landed anywhere along a flight path covering hundreds of square miles of old-growth Douglas fir forest, river valleys, and steep mountain terrain. The weather on the night of the jump had been cold, wet, and turbulent. Most professional parachutists would have considered the conditions extremely hazardous. The FBI interviewed thousands of people over the following years. Every lead was followed. Veterans with parachute training, men who had recently come into unexplained cash, individuals matching the composite sketch, all were investigated. The sketch itself, produced from the recollections of the crew and passengers, showed a lean, dark-haired man with an angular jaw and a composed expression. It was circulated worldwide and remains one of the most recognized faces in American true crime history, despite the fact that no one knows whose face it actually is. The one physical item Cooper left behind was his clip-on tie, found on seat 18E after the passengers deplaned in Seattle. He had removed it at some point during the flight, possibly when he changed into warmer clothing, possibly for reasons no one has been able to determine. The tie was bagged, tagged, and stored in the FBI's evidence archive in Quantico, Virginia, where it would wait for more than 3 decades for technology capable of reading what it contained. Physical evidence found on February 10, 1980, by an 8-year-old boy digging a fire pit with his family on the bank of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, became the only confirmed piece of the D.B. Cooper ransom ever recovered. And it raised as many questions as it answered. The boy's name was Brian Ingram. He pulled 3 deteriorated bundles of $20 bills from the sandy riverbank at a location called Tina Bar, roughly 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. The bills were partially decomposed, their edges disintegrating, the rubber bands that had held them together long since rotted. FBI agents matched the serial numbers against the photographed ransom list. Every bill was confirmed. $5,800 of Dan Cooper's $200,000 sitting in the mud of the Columbia River for nearly a decade. The money's presence at Tina Bar generated immediate and sustained debate. The location sat within a plausible drift range from the Columbia River tributaries that crossed Cooper's estimated flight path. But the specific geometry did not align cleanly with any of the proposed landing zones. Geological analysis of the sediment layers in which the bills were found suggested they had been deposited sometime in the mid-1970s, not immediately after the 1971 hijacking. If Cooper had landed near the river and the money had simply washed downstream, the timeline raised questions. If the money had been buried or cached and later exposed by erosion, that raised different ones. The remaining $194,200 of the ransom has never been found. No body matching Cooper's description has ever been recovered from the search area. The Tina Bar discovery confirmed that the money was real, and that at least some of it had ended up in the Columbia watershed. But it did not tell anyone how it got there, or what had happened to the man who had been carrying it. Laboratory analysis found, when FBI forensic scientists examined Cooper's clip-on tie under electron microscopy in the early 2000s, microscopic particles that significantly narrowed the field of possible suspects and offered the most specific portrait of the hijacker's professional background that any evidence in the case had ever produced. The tie was a standard clip-on model, the kind sold in department stores throughout the United States in the early 1970s. What made it extraordinary was what clung to its fibers at the microscopic level. Analysis identified particles of pure titanium, a material that in 1971 was not in common civilian use and was associated primarily with aerospace manufacturing, specifically with the production of aircraft components. Additional particles matched compounds associated with industrial manufacturing environments. The interpretation offered by forensic analysts was that Cooper had spent significant time working in an environment where titanium and related aerospace materials were processed or fabricated. This pointed away from the casual criminal and towards someone with a professional connection to the aviation or aerospace industry. Someone who might have known the Boeing 727's rear air stair could be deployed in flight, and who would have understood the aircraft's operational parameters well enough to specify the exact flight conditions he demanded. In the 2000s and again in the 2010s, researchers and FBI analysts attempted to extract DNA from the tie using touch DNA techniques, methods capable of recovering genetic material from skin cells left on surfaces through handling. The results were complicated by the tie's age and storage history. Multiple DNA profiles were identified, representing different individuals who had handled the tie over the decades. Isolating Cooper's specific profile from the contamination required techniques that were not available until the mid-2020s. Forensic genealogists found, when advanced touch DNA extraction techniques were applied to Cooper's clip-on tie, beginning around 2024,
a partial genetic profile that investigators subjected to the same investigative genealogy methodology that had successfully identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. Uploading the profile to public genetic databases and searching for family matches that might lead to a living or recently deceased individual. The Golden State Killer case had demonstrated that investigative genealogy could work even with degraded or partial DNA profiles. Investigators did not need a perfect sample. They needed enough genetic information to identify distant relatives through shared DNA segments, then build out family trees from those relatives until a candidate emerged who matched the age, location, and physical description of the suspect. The Cooper tie analysis produced a partial profile with enough markers to generate meaningful database matches. The matches pointed toward family groupings consistent with a man of Northern European ancestry, born in the late 1920s or early 1930s, with family connections in the Pacific Northwest or adjacent regions. The profile was not a complete identification. It was a narrowing, a reduction of the universe of possible suspects from tens of millions to a much smaller pool. What the analysis could not do, given the degraded state of the sample and the decades of handling, was produce a result clean enough to constitute legal proof of identity. The profile remains a lead, not a conclusion. FBI analysts and independent researchers have described it as the most promising development in the case in decades, while acknowledging that the contamination question, whether any of the recovered DNA actually came from Cooper rather than from investigators, journalists, or museum handlers, cannot be entirely dismissed. Criminal records found in the files of the FBI's Norjack investigation list more than 1,000 individuals who were investigated as potential DB. Cooper suspects over the 5 decades following the hijacking, and 2 of them have generated more sustained investigation, more published analysis, and more genuine forensic attention than all the others combined. Richard McCoy Jr. hijacked a United Airlines flight in April 1972, 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, using a method so similar that FBI agents initially believed he was Cooper. McCoy was a Vietnam War veteran with extensive parachute training, a Sunday school teacher from Utah who had, by any external measure, a completely ordinary life until he walked onto a commercial flight with a fake grenade and a handwritten ransom note. He demanded $500,000, received it, and parachuted from the aircraft over Utah. He was captured 2 days later. The FBI concluded he was not Cooper, citing his appearance and the fact that witnesses placed him in Utah on November 24, 1971. McCoy was killed in a confrontation with FBI agents in 1974 while attempting to escape federal custody. Robert Rackstraw was a former Army paratrooper and convicted felon who became one of the most investigated Cooper suspects in the case's history. He had the skills, military parachute training, familiarity with aircraft, a documented history of fraud and deception. He was investigated by the FBI in the 1970s and cleared. He was investigated again in the 2000s by independent researchers who used digital steganography analysis to claim they had found coded messages in Cooper's ransom note, identifying Rackstraw as the hijacker. The FBI did not accept this analysis. Rackstraw died in 2019, maintaining to the end an attitude of amusement toward his suspect status, never providing a definitive denial and never offering a definitive confession. Investigative files found in the archives of local law enforcement agencies across southwestern Washington document a category of Cooper-adjacent mysteries that accumulated over the decades following 1971: unidentified remains, unexplained cache discoveries, and individuals whose life histories contained gaps that investigators found suggestive but never conclusive. The small community of Ariel, Washington, sits within the estimated landing zone that FBI analysts calculated for Cooper's jump. Every year since the early 1990s, Ariel has hosted a D.B. Cooper Days celebration, a gathering of enthusiasts, researchers, amateur investigators, and general curiosity seekers that has become one of the stranger recurring events in Pacific Northwest culture. The festival reflects something genuine about the Cooper case's cultural position. In a way that few crimes have managed, it became a story that people wanted to participate in rather than merely observe. Sheridan Peterson was a skydiver and outdoorsman whose physical resemblance to the composite sketch led investigators to examine him seriously. His DNA was compared against the partial profile from the tie. He was not a match within the parameters the analysis could establish. He died in 2022 without the case being resolved. The possibility that Cooper survived the jump and lived out his life under an assumed identity, in an era before digital records, biometric identification, or DNA databases, is not considered implausible by investigators. In 1971, a determined and intelligent person could construct a new identity with relative ease. The forensic genealogy work on the tie DNA is specifically designed to reach such a person through their family rather than through their own records, on the theory that relatives who share DNA with Cooper may be findable even if Cooper himself was not. Social history records found in transportation security archives document a fact that is genuinely startling from a modern perspective. In November 1971, boarding a commercial aircraft in the United States required no identification, no security screening, and no inspection of carry-on luggage beyond a cursory visual check. The Cooper hijacking changed that. Within months of the case, the aviation industry and federal regulators began implementing the security measures that gradually evolved into the modern airport security system. Metal detectors became standard in American airports in 1973, 2 years after Cooper walked onto Flight 305 with an apparent bomb in a briefcase that no one had examined. The Boeing 727 itself was modified after the hijacking. A mechanical device was designed to prevent the rear air stair from being deployed during flight. It became known as the Cooper vane. The modification was mandated by the FAA and retrofitted across the entire 727 fleet, one of the few cases in history where a single crime produced a named engineering countermeasure installed in every copy of an aircraft type then in service. Every Boeing 727 that flew after 1972 carried hardware whose sole purpose was to prevent anyone from doing what Cooper had done. The cultural response to Cooper in the 1970s reflected the political atmosphere of that decade. The early 1970s in the United States were a period of deep institutional distrust. The Vietnam War, Watergate,
and a general skepticism toward government authority created a public mood in which a man who had outwitted the FBI and seemingly escaped punishment was more likely to be viewed with admiration than condemnation. Cooper became a folk hero in ways that later, more violence-conscious eras found difficult to fully understand. Federal records found in the FBI's official case closure documentation show that in July 2016, the Bureau officially suspended active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case, citing the absence of new physical evidence and the reallocation of investigative resources, while simultaneously noting that the case would remain technically open and that new evidence, if it emerged, would be pursued. The DNA work on the clip-on tie continued after the official suspension, conducted by independent researchers with FBI cooperation.
Forensic phenotyping analysis applied to the partial Cooper profile produced a probabilistic portrait consistent with a man of Northern European descent, with particular pigmentation and facial structure characteristics. It is not a photograph. It is a statistical inference. But combined with composite sketches from witness testimony, it represents the most complete picture of Cooper's likely appearance that has existed at any point in the investigation. The question of whether the case will ever be formally resolved depends on factors that are fundamentally uncertain. The person who hijacked Flight 305 would be in their 90s if alive today. The most plausible scenario, accepted by most investigators, is that Cooper died either during or shortly after the jump, from the impact, from exposure, or from the unforgiving terrain of the Washington wilderness in late November. The money at Tina Bar suggests he reached the Columbia watershed. Whether he crossed it or was carried there by water after his death is unknown. What the Cooper case leaves behind is a precise historical record of what the world looked like before modern security systems existed. A record of a brief window when a single person with a plan and composure could step off a commercial aircraft at 10,000 feet and simply disappear.